And one of the things that's very exciting to me about this campaign is that it is just that sort of very precise, very crisp focus.
I agree.
That has some time urgency, which also always helps. I mean, at the moment, we're hoping to get the state legislature to pass a resolution, at least the House branch, urging the congressional delegation to work to block the basing of the F-35s in Burlington. And that, in the best case, would be voted on in this session, which is going to end fairly soon. It's in committee at the moment, so there's sort of a struggle to get it out of committee and then to secure a positive vote on the floor. And that's all something that, you know, in the next few weeks, we want to be contacting as many members of the House as possible to get them to vote for this and to push for it to be released from committee. Because I guess there's some possibility that it will just get bottled up in committee and never even reach the floor.
What committee is it?
Military Affairs and Housing,
Mm-hmm.
which Tom Stevens is the chair of. He's a representative from the Waterbury, Huntington, Bolton area.
And the other thing about the issue that I think is really good is that it's kind of it's the best of local issues in that it immediately raises a conversation about the broader national policy decisions that need to be made. The reason for not basing the F-35s in Vermont is partially to protect Vermont by not putting a big target sign on the state, but partially it's to set an example of the state that says, this is not the way we want to go. These weapons are not in our security interest, they endanger us, and we really need to have a different nuclear policy than the one which our government is currently pursuing. I mean, the hope, I think, is explicit that this would serve as a model for other states to take action about stationing F-35s, but also about the whole array of policy decisions that need to be made about nuclear weapons in the coming years. The F-35 is part of this huge buildup that's planned, $1.7 trillion over the next 30 years to modernize and enhance the nuclear arsenal, every single component of it, the land-based missiles, the airplane-dropped bombs, and the sea-based missiles. And if we go ahead with that, it's going to stimulate an arms race throughout the world. Other countries will try to match what we're doing. And it will just make the world even more dangerous. It's one of the main developments which is destabilizing the situation, leading us closer to nuclear war. So there's a tremendous benefit potentially from getting Vermont to take this very strong position and not allowing the bombers to be based here.
So last night we started with reading Roseanne Greco's statement, and we could do that again if that would be useful for people to hear. And then we have a few announcements and calls to action. Then we can also discuss, and I think it makes sense with this group that people can just jump in and ask questions and get engaged at whatever level your growing awareness is with these issues. So if I could begin with that, I'll go ahead and read it. So this was written by Colonel Roseanne Greco. As a matter of fact, there's a short bio of her at the end of it. She served on active duty in the U.S. Air Force for 30 years. She was a member of the intelligence community and specialized in nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon targeting. She was a delegate to 4 international nuclear arms control negotiations, including the Strategic Arms Reduction Talks, START. Colonel Greco is a former chair of the South Burlington City Council and has been a staunch opponent of the F-35 basing in Vermont. And so here's what she says. The Department of Defense's 2018 Nuclear Posture Review contained a message of enormous significance for Vermonters. It designated the F-35 as a part of its strategic nuclear bomber force. This is the first time a fighter has been so designated. That makes the F-35 completely different from the F-16 or any earlier nuclear-wired fighter. Numerous high-level Defense Department officials have elaborated on the role that the F-35 will play in regional nuclear deterrence, that is, in so-called small nuclear wars. The F-35 will carry what has been called the most dangerous nuclear weapon in America's arsenal, the B-61-12 guided nuclear bomb that is custom-tailored for the F-35. The Pentagon has been developing this new nuclear bomb specifically for the F-35's bomb bay since 2010. The B-61-12 nuclear bomb has settings for 4 different sizes of nuclear blast, referred to as dial-a-yield capability. Because the B-61-12's smallest setting is only 1/3 of a kiloton, military war planners are talking about this as a usable nuclear weapon. And even more dangerous, because of the F-35's stealth technology and the accuracy of its B-61-12 bomb, the F-35 is being considered a first-strike nuclear weapon. Not since the worst Cold War crises has the U.S. been as close to a nuclear war as we are now. This is because our current administration is ripping up nuclear arms control treaties, budgeting $1.5 trillion for new nuclear weapons, and most frighteningly, modernizing most of them with smaller, more usable nuclear weapons, while openly stating that these nuclear weapons will give us the option of conducting a first nuclear strike against non-nuclear threats. Moreover, our current president seems not to understand nuclear weapons or the consequences of using them. In fact, he has spoken about wanting to use nuclear weapons. Current F-35 models with their current computer system, including the ones scheduled for Burlington, do not yet have the nuclear capability. Pentagon officials estimate that the F-35 could be armed with the B-61-12 bomb as early as 2020. Once this occurs, all new models of the F-35 will be nuclear capable, and previously produced F-35s, including Vermont's, will be upgraded with the same nuclear capability. Because the military is not required to release information about military capabilities and missions, it is highly unlikely that Vermonters will be told when our F-35s become nuclear capable. Therefore, Vermonters will likely never know, just as Vermonters were never told the last time the Vermont Air National Guard was assigned a nuclear mission. In the 1960s, the F-89, the fighter model then being flown by the Vermont Air Guard, was upgraded to be nuclear capable. Shortly thereafter, the Vermont Air Guard was assigned a nuclear mission and actually flew from Burlington carrying nuclear weapons. Even though the F-16s had nuclear wiring, they were never declared part of our strategic nuclear triad as the F-35 is now. Thus, the F-16 posed no strategic nuclear threat to Russia or China, and Vermont was never a nuclear target. However, the F-35 is now part of our nuclear triad. It will carry a usable nuclear bomb. It's been discussed officially as being a first-strike nuclear weapon, and the Vermont Air Guard is the first operational guard base for the F-35. There are 2 huge implications for Vermont from these facts. First, the Vermont Air Guard's F-35s will immediately become a huge threat to our enemies, and Vermont will become a nuclear target. It's important to clarify that in nuclear targeting, it is the delivery vehicles and their bases which are targeted, not the warheads. So it's the bombers and the bomb bases which are the targets, not the bombs. And second, in our name, the Vermont Air Guard could be assigned by the President to drop a nuclear weapon on another country. The F-35 will carry 2 nuclear bombs. Each bomb has a maximum yield of 50 kilotons. The nuclear bomb we dropped on Hiroshima was only 15 kilotons. It killed 146,000 people. About 90,000 died on the first day, and 56,000 people died over the next 4 to 6 months. Because it is a single-seat fighter, the F-35 is a far more dangerous nuclear bomber than our other 2 current strategic bombers. the B-52s and B-2s. They have crews. The F-35 has only one human being in control. So one F-35 pilot with one push of the button could imperil the planet. If Vermont's F-35s are assigned a nuclear mission, then the beginning of a nuclear war could start from Vermont. However, if Vermonters say no to basing nuclear bombers in Vermont, then the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons could start from Vermont. Either of these outcomes may depend on the choices Vermont legislators will make in May. So I'd just like to open up for questions. And
Can you email me that, and then I'll email it to all the people in the peace group? Good.
yes, if you could sign in addition to the petition, if you can sign in on the sheet and just make a note of that.
I did.
Very good.
I mean, I signed my name, but I'll
Yeah.
ask you to do that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you think you could come for the potluck, the next meeting?
I'll have to check my schedule. If I
Okay.
Yeah, there. What wasn't mentioned there, Jennifer, was the fact that the F-35s was sold, and their biggest claim to fame was it is a stealth aircraft. That means it is coated with a non-radar reflecting material, which ostensibly renders it invisible to radar. The premise is that having that stealth capability, they would be able to penetrate the enemy country without being detected, and then continue on and drop their weapon. What isn't widely known is that that material, when it catches fire, is a toxic material. About a month ago, I was with a delegation of the Vermont chapter of Veterans for Peace, and we met with John Tracy, Senator Leahy's Vermont contact in Burlington. And I tried to emphasize to him that, in my experience, most aircraft accidents occur either on landing or takeoff. And there are a number of factors why that's the case. It could be a weather factor, for whatever reason the aircraft ran out of fuel. There could be some kind of electronic mistransmission for a electronic guided landing. More often than not, it's because of pilot error. Maybe he forgets to put down the landing gear. That's happened. Maybe he overshoots. That's happened. Maybe he gets too slow, the aircraft stalls, crashes. All those things happen. My concern is that if they put this aircraft in Burlington, it's not a case of if an accident will happen, it's a case of when it will happen. The F-16 has been flying hundreds and hundreds of hours, but the Vermont Air National Guard pilots who will be piloting this craft, they will have to transition first from the F-16 to the F-35. My concern is that they are very different aircraft, they have very different handling characteristics, they have very different power settings, the trims are very, very different on these kinds of aircraft. And it will take the Vermont Air National Guard pilots a while to become, they need to be more than proficient, they need to be expert at it. Probably if you ask any of them, they will say, oh, we're the best pilots in the world, and not to worry, we know what we're doing, it's not a problem. I don't believe it, I don't believe it. When I was on active duty in the Navy, the squadron that I was with, it was a heavy attack jet bomber. We operated off of aircraft carriers. For 2 years I practiced dropping atomic bombs. In my squadron of 12 aircraft, 5 of them crashed. 3 because they were either on landing or on a takeoff configuration. One of the aircraft that crashed, he took off, this was out of NAS Jacksonville, Florida. He took off and immediately had a complete electrical malfunction. The crew bailed out. The first guy got out at 800 feet, The pilot was able to stay with the plane and steer it away from a populated area. He bailed out, his chute opened, and he was on the ground. The plane crashed. There was a complete electrical malfunction. Handheld on takeoff. Those kind of things can happen on military aircraft. The most recent F-35 crashes were on landings, trying to land. They were able to trace the malfunction to a mechanical part, which has been fixed. Not to worry, everything's okay. It's been fixed. Yeah, good luck with that. It'll happen again someplace, somewhere. High performance aircraft are very, very dangerous. Their flight characteristics on landing are very, very difficult to control.
I think something particularly ill-advised about basing this aircraft at an airport, which is basically a civilian airport, in a city near population centers, as opposed to at some military base that's a greater remove from population centers. But the thing that I really find striking in Colonel Greco's statement is the way she relates this overwhelmingly to the danger of nuclear war. That regardless of the local, in my backyard type issues, the real problem with this plane is that it increases the chance that there will be a nuclear war. It's part of a buildup which is designed to give the United States a nuclear war fighting capability greater than it has already. And that's just the wrong way for this country to be moving. We don't want to make nuclear war easier to fight. We want to make it impossible to have a nuclear war. And the whole $1.7 trillion plan is all about creating more usable nuclear weapons. This is one of the most egregious examples of that. And it flows, again, from this bizarre notion that a nuclear war can somehow be contained. So much of our nuclear planning just takes place in a vacuum, where we don't take into account what's going to happen when the weapons get used. And the planners play this elaborate game of sort of chess, figuring out how these weapons will be used and how they'll deter and all this. And they don't look at the facts, the reality of what's going to happen when the bombs go off. And one of the things that we've learned in recent years is that a very limited nuclear war, the sort that this plane is designed to fight in, will not be a small local event. It'll be a worldwide catastrophe in all likelihood.
Absolutely.
If it doesn't lead to a full-scale nuclear war between the United States and Russia, which it certainly could, even if it's a relatively contained conflict, it has enormous potential for widespread harm. We've been looking for the last 12 years now, 13 years, at a scenario in which there's a limited nuclear war. We specifically looked at South Asia as the site where this might take place because of the very dangerous situation between India and Pakistan. But the findings really can be translated to any part of the globe. And what we found is that if you use just 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs out of the 14,500 weapons in the world's arsenals, many of which are much, much, much larger than Hiroshima, but if you use just 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs against urban targets, you can kill millions of people directly from the explosions and the fire and the radiation. But far more dangerously, you can cause worldwide, global climate disruption.
Yes.
Because all the soot from all the fires gets lofted into the upper atmosphere.
Yep.
And it blocks out the sun, and it shortens the growing season, and
Yep.
it cuts down on temperatures and precipitation,
Yep.
and you get a worldwide impact on food production that leads to a global famine.
Yes.
And calculations that we've done have shown that war between India and Pakistan, for example, using just 100 Hiroshima-sized bombs, could put over 2 billion people at risk of starvation, which event would be the end of civilization as we know it. If anything approaching that happened, the current economic system would just collapse.
The example in 1816, there's an island between Java and Sumatra. It was a volcanic island. It was called Tambura. In 1816, that volcano exploded. They estimated put up maybe 5 cubic miles of earth, rock, material into the atmosphere. It was later called the year without a summer, because it migrated to the northern latitudes and it prevented the normal amount of sunlight from penetrating all the debris from that volcanic eruption. It was the year without a summer. And that's exactly what will happen in a nuclear holocaust. When I was serving on active duty, some of our senior pilots went away to a school, let's say, where they became involved in planning strikes on enemy targets. I talked to one of them when he came back, and he very jokingly said that, well, we started out using a small nuclear weapon, but the other side decided that they better use a bigger nuclear weapon. And the whole thing just escalated with each of these adversaries going to a larger and larger nuclear weapon. And this concept of a, quote, usable nuclear weapon is insane. It's absolutely insane.
And since Nagasaki, we have been successful in maintaining a firewall between us and nuclear war. There have been all kinds of conflicts, but the idea that nuclear weapons shouldn't be used has been the dominant idea in military circles. And this quest for more usable nuclear weapons really threatens to blur and then destroy that line.
Right.
And get us to a situation where using nuclear weapons is considered thinkable. It used to be unthinkable, now it would be thinkable. And as you just said, the experience we have with war games, at least, is that whenever nuclear weapons are used, it is extremely difficult to control what happens next. And in most of the war games that have been staged, if a single nuclear weapon is used, the situation rapidly escalates to large-scale nuclear war. No one knows how to back down in that situation. And despite that, it's a major part of U.S. military planning now. It is increasingly part of Russian military planning. It's very much part of military planning in South Asia, in both India and Pakistan. And there's a divorce from reality that's really frightening. These plans may make perfect sense if you're playing a board game, but nuclear war is not a game of chess. And the disconnect from reality is really, really disturbing.
Well, of course, the whole nuclear policy, national defense policy, during the Cold War, kept increasing the probability of one side or the other using a nuclear weapon. In the 1950s, when I served, the concept was, well, if the Soviets hit us, we're going to strike back, okay? It was kind of a tit-for-tat sort of a philosophy. As each side gained more and more nuclear weapons, the strategic thinking became, well, instead of tit-for-tat, we're going to hit them harder, which became the policy of mutual assured destruction. Take the capital letters, mutual M, assured A, D, destruction. It was mad. That's how the whole thing escalated. And about 1989, if I'm not mistaken, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara wrote a book called In Retrospect. Basically, the book contained his reportage of meetings and conferences between himself, tippity-top American military people, and former tippity-top Soviet Union military people. And basically what they did was rehash the Cold War. The thing that struck me was that as you read the book, the conclusion I came to, each side was afraid that the other one was going to strike first, okay? So they had to defend against that. And the way they chose to defend against that was to get more, bigger, faster, higher, farther, nuclear weapons. That was the whole concept of deterrent. It was based on making sure that the other adversary was afraid of attacking you because they were assured that they would be annihilated.
There's a great cartoon from that era which shows two people in a room that they're knee-deep in gasoline, and one of them has 3 matches and the other one has 2 matches, and the guy with 3 matches says, "I'm ahead."
Yeah.
Or something like that. And I think it really captures the insanity of it. One of the things that we've been trying to do is to help people understand that this notion of deterrence, of mutually assured destruction protecting us from nuclear war, is really a terribly dangerous myth. There's, people point to the fact that there hasn't been a nuclear war, a use of nuclear weapons against a city since Nagasaki. And that just doesn't prove the case at all.
Right,
Personally, I'm almost as old as the nuclear era. I haven't died yet. It doesn't mean I'm not going to. And the fact that we haven't used these weapons yet doesn't mean that we're not going to use them. And in fact, we know, even if there's not an explicit decision by some country to start a nuclear war, we know of at least 6 occasions when either Moscow or Washington actively began the process of launching their nuclear arsenal in the mistaken belief that they were under attack by the other side.
That's correct.
On each of these occasions, they essentially abandoned the deterrence doctrine. They said it's failed, we're under attack, we're going to have a nuclear war, and went about their merry way. And on each of these occasions, we were really saved with minutes away from nuclear war. And as Robert McNamara said about this aspect of the situation, we lucked out. It was luck that prevented nuclear war. It wasn't the wisdom of our leaders or the soundness of our doctrines or the sophistication of our technology. We were incredibly lucky. And the nuclear policy of the United States today and of the other 8 nuclear armed countries is really nothing more than a hope for continued good luck, which is a fairly insane basis for national security policy. This campaign here in Vermont, I think, helps to draw attention to that. The insanity of putting these nuclear warheads in an airport within the metropolitan area of Burlington, making Burlington a major target is just crazy. We need to stop that, and we need to have a really fundamental change in nuclear policy. And one of the great things about this campaign is that it does link up in some ways to a national campaign called Back from the Brink, which is taking place all around the country with organizations, communities, state legislatures, city councils, labor unions, church groups, all joining together saying that we need a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy. The campaign has put together a 5-point platform for what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be, which is spelled out on their website, preventnuclearwar.org. And they're inviting organizations like the Peace Council here in Bennington to endorse this platform, and then to go into the community and to talk to church groups, get individual churches to endorse this, to try to get people in the state legislature to consider perhaps passing a resolution about this next year. It's currently in the legislature in Maine, in Massachusetts, in Washington, in Hawaii, in Oregon, in New Jersey, and it's being introduced in a number of other states. Also, a resolution about this has been introduced in the U.S. House of Representatives, House Resolution 302, by Congressman McGovern and Congressman Blumenauer. And the campaign is trying to get other members of Congress to sign on to this resolution, and in general to build a new national consensus that we need a fundamental change in nuclear policy. If not during this administration, then during the administration which will follow it.
I think key to the success of that kind of campaign is making the public aware of what happens when there is a nuclear catastrophe. The United States has easily killed more United States citizens with atomic weapons. I don't know how many in Russia, but the numbers in the United States are appalling. On the night of April 23rd, 1953, there was a spring thunderstorm over Troy, New York. A professor at Rensselaer Polytech looked out his window the next morning, and there was a white dust over everything. He took his Geiger counter, went out, and the Geiger counter probably went off the scale. Historically, it was the highest reading of nuclear contamination anywhere in the country outside of Ground Zero at the Nevada test site. What had happened was that one of those atmospheric explosions they were conducting in the early 50s, it was called Plum Bob Charlie. It exploded with much, much more force than what they had calculated. The debris from that experimental shot was carried up into the atmosphere. The jet stream carried all that radioactive debris across the country, It got over Troy, New York, where it met a spring thunderstorm, and it dumped all that radioactive debris on the ground. There's a book about it called It's a Good Day When It Doesn't Rain. It describes that whole incident. Not to mention the people who lived in a place called St. George, Utah, which was due east of the Nevada test site, and how many of them came down with cancer derived from radioactive fallout. There have been any number of instances where in those days, nuclear weapons carried by Air Force bombers were accidentally dropped. There was one dropped over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Because of the safety features on them, there were 5. 4 of them failed. And when one of those nuclear weapons hit the ground, it was the high explosive that detonated, but came down, and it was the configuration of the weapon was so damaged when it landed, it was not able to trigger the whole nuclear core, the whole nuclear pit. It comes to be that close. Those incidents are called broken arrow, and there's been any number of them. There was a ICBM in a missile site in Arkansas that a workman messed up, and he was working on this missile. He dropped a wrench. This is a true story. He dropped the wrench, which broke a hole in the shell of this ICBM, and the propellant came out, okay, and it ignited. And in time, that whole silo was full of fire, and the ICBM was literally blown out of the silo. The warhead didn't go off, but it landed about 5 miles away from where the silo was in Cheyenne, Arkansas. It's crazy stuff like that. And there's no doubt in my mind that that kind of a situation can prevail even with a, quote, usable, hey, it's only a little A bomb, it's not going to hurt, really. You know, it's kind of like saying it's a smart bomb, it doesn't hurt, right? But it's a small enough nuclear weapon that, hey, not to worry. But accidents are going to happen, there's no doubt in my mind.
So I'm curious to know what thoughts people have about previous efforts in activism that have been effective and impactful in terms of changing the conversation and changing outcomes, like the nuclear freeze efforts in the 1980s.
I think it's important for people to understand how much power they do have. You know, there's a certain sense of hopelessness that people sometimes feel confronting the nuclear danger. This is the end of civilization if we don't do this right. And I'm one little person, what can I do about this? And the fact is that we have, in the past, we being aroused public citizenry, accomplished enormous things in this regard. In the early 1980s, 1981, when Ronald Reagan became president, he was the most hawkish president we've ever had with regards to nuclear weapons. It was his stated policy that he wanted to develop an arsenal that would enable him to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. And he actually built it. We deployed in 1983, 2 years after he became president, we deployed Pershing missiles in Germany that were able to hit Moscow in 6 minutes, took out any warning time the Soviets had, and were basically there to enable us to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union. It was an extraordinarily dangerous time, and in response to that danger, literally millions of people became politically active around the issue of nuclear war. The demonstration in Central Park in June of 1982 was the largest demonstration in U.S. history, over 1 million people, calling for an end to the Cold War arms race. There was a nationwide campaign, on which the Back from the Brink campaign is modeled, called the Freeze Campaign. A very simple statement of what U.S.-Soviet nuclear policy should be. We should freeze the arms race, stop building more nuclear warheads, and then work back from there to get rid of them. And it was dismissed as irresponsible and dangerous to stop building more nuclear warheads, but people didn't pay heed to those criticisms coming from the proponents of nuclear weapons. Millions of people got active, and just 3 years after he was inaugurated, a very strange thing happened. Ronald Reagan said, nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. It was a 180-degree change in what he had been saying. And when he said it, it was in early 1984, people thought, well, this is just rhetoric for the 1984 election cycle. but it wasn't. His thinking had actually undergone a profound change in response to the data that was presented to him about what was going to happen if there was a nuclear war. Being Ronald Reagan, he paid a lot of attention to the movies, and the movie The Day After had a tremendous impact on him. Dr. Helen Caldicott, who is one of the founders of my organization, Physicians for Social Responsibility, had an extended interview with him in the family quarters of the White House and explained to him in detail what was going to happen if nuclear weapons were used. And at the same time, we were able to talk to Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. And the two of them both got it. They realized that what they were doing was insanely dangerous. And from this moment when we were literally heading towards nuclear war, with this out-of-control Cold War arms race, they sat down and began the process of stopping and then reversing the Cold War arms race so that when the Cold War ended in 1989, there were fewer nuclear warheads, and many more have since been taken apart. We've dismantled over 50,000 nuclear warheads in response to this kind of political activity. So when we talk about the need to get rid of the 15,000 remaining, it's not an undoable task. We're simply telling ourselves that we need to do again what we've already done successfully once before. And that to me is very important because
How many did you say are remaining?
there are about 14,500. And 90% of those, 90% plus, are in the US and Russian arsenals. The rest are in the other 7 nuclear armed states' arsenals. The US and Russia are clearly the key to this situation. One or the other or both of them are going to have to provide the leadership for a worldwide movement. And that's why, here in the United States, we've launched Back from the Brink because we think that we can affect policy here in the United States. We're not calling on the United States to disarm unilaterally. We're calling on the United States to provide leadership for a multilateral effort to get rid of all the weapons, not unilateral disarmament, but universal disarmament. And if the US were to do that, I think it could be successful. Just as Gorbachev was successful when he initiated the steps in the 1980s and approached Reagan and said, look, we got to change. We're going to kill ourselves and our children. We can't keep doing this. It would require some very serious effort on the part of the U.S. leadership to do it. They would have to invest some important political capital. But along with climate change, this is the great issue of our era. And for all the other terribly serious problems that we face, if we don't deal with these two, nothing else is going to matter because we won't be here. 1,000 years from now, when people look back on the early 21st century, they're going to only care about two things. Did we stop climate change? Did we get rid of the nuclear weapons? That's what they're going to worry about.
I think the key to that, those decisions were made with the very top leaders of the two adversary states, Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. My concern is the kind of leadership that's begun to show itself in this country now. I think if there's any chance of any nuclear disarmament, it's got to be a grassroots movement. It's got to start with the people in the street. It's got to start with state legislatures. It's got to start with state governments. It's got to start with state governments convincing congressional representatives to stand up and be counted against nuclear weapons.
Exactly.
It's going to take that kind of political will to do it.
And that's what made it possible for Reagan to change. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't just that he changed his mind. There was enormous political pressure coming from the grassroots in the 80s, demanding that this take place. And in the case of Gorbachev, perhaps more an individual's great insight into the truth of the moment. But in this country, the way it works, it's clearly going to have to be that kind of broad political movement.
Yeah.
And I think, I don't have a lot of optimism about the current administration, given its nature. But there are 20 people running at this point on the Democratic side, and there's at least one challenger on the Republican side. Amongst those candidates for president in 2020, we need to speak to all of them and get them to understand that the current moment, we cannot afford to elect a good president in 2020. We have to elect a great president.
Yeah.
And the definition of greatness at this moment in time is an ability to successfully deal with climate change and the nuclear threat.
I think clearly people's awareness about a nuclear threat is become front and center. I mean, a year ago, there was practically that kind of direct confrontation between Kim Il-jung and the United States. North Korea is a rogue country, I think. They have developed this capability. They have tested their nukes. They have tested their strategic missiles, their intermediate range missiles. To my view, they are a distinct and viable threat. How that threat can be removed, I believe, is what President Trump has been trying to do. Whether or not he is having any success, don't know. Doesn't seem to be so far, from what the latest intelligence reports seem to indicate from their aerial photography. And the fact that Kim Il-jung recently tested a new missile, that kind of tells me that he has not given up on the capability to deliver a nuclear weapon. That has to be front and center of this president's priorities. It's a clear and present danger. He's got to deal with it.
Well, I think the failure of Trump in Korea illustrates a really important point, which is that these negotiations need to be undertaken with great seriousness and with a lot of thought and deliberation. You know, when Trump went into the summit in Singapore, utterly unprepared, there was no groundwork done before it. It was all a public relations event.
Yeah.
And that will not do. That's not what we're looking for. We're not looking for a kumbaya moment. We're looking for a serious process in which the government of the United States commits real resources to figuring out what would it take to get the other 8 nuclear nations to join us in an agreement. And that includes what it's going to take to get North Korea to get rid of its nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
There are a couple of other countries that are going to be very difficult to bring along. But it can be done if it's done seriously by people who are putting real energy and real thought into this process rather than trying to stage a public relations coup.
Yeah, well, I think so far President Trump has done nothing to advance the position of helping North Korea reduce its nuclear weapons. What he has done is maintain the sanctions on the country, and in fact he's put more sanctions on. That is, in my mind, not any way at all to try to create any kind of a common bridge between himself and Kim Il-jung. It's just not going to happen. Just as Kim Il-jung has made reference to, he doesn't even want the Secretary of State Pompeo to be involved in any direct negotiations. I mean, you've got personality conflicts, you've got positional conflicts, you've got strategic conflicts, and those things are not easily resolvable, but they can be resolvable with serious discussions and serious diplomacy. That's what has to happen.
It seems unlikely that this administration is going to do any of those things. And I think it really becomes a question of how we talk to the candidates. And we do it, I think, directly. But as you were suggesting, we do it indirectly by creating a political groundswell that they have to pay attention to.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, when a politician says, well, we need to station the F-35 here in Burlington because it's going to create jobs. We need to sit down with that person and explain that there are risks which are not worth running to create jobs, as important as jobs are. We need to figure out ways to create jobs that don't endanger the planet.
That's a tough one, Ira. Senator Patrick Leahy is all in favor of bringing the F-35 to Burlington.
Yes, he is.
That's a fact. John Tracy, when we met with him, he basically said about taking the F-35 out, forget it. It's not going to happen. My view is the first duty of any politician is to get himself reelected. To get reelected, you need as many votes as you can. If you bring votes in with a military setup, that's money in the bank for that politician. It's just the same way that every congressional district in this country has some kind of defense contract in it. Follow the money. That's where the $718 billion in fiscal year 19 defense budget goes. That's where it's going.
Do we know if Senator Leahy was aware of the nuclear capability? That's one question. And a follow-up question to that would be, is it possible that learning that now, or the present circumstances in terms of the development of quote-unquote usable nukes, might actually be something that we could leverage in terms of raising his awareness? If
My
Reagan
opinion is he could care less.
But if Reagan could change his mind,
Yeah, I think that's not,
then
that may be
it's-
true, but we don't know that, and we can't, and we shouldn't assume that. I think we need to act as though it's possible. We need to try to talk to him directly and make sure that he understands what he's doing, because this is not meant as a criticism of him or any other individual. It's just a fact that we observe all the time. Politicians make decisions about nuclear weapons without at all understanding what the consequences of the use of those weapons will be. Reagan thought he could call back a missile after it was launched, most famously. But we've spoken, my organization personally, have spoken to many world leaders, and it is frightening how ill-informed they are about what these weapons will do if used. So we need to talk to him directly. But more importantly, as you were suggesting, we need to create a political groundswell,
Yeah.
so that when he's doing the calculation, well, jobs will bring me so many votes. All these people are furious that I'm putting their children at risk by putting nuclear
Yeah.
weapons here.
They ain't going to vote for you.
They're not going to vote for me if I do that. That's its weight appropriately as well.
Yeah.
Because that is the way politicians often
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
Sometimes they make judgments based on what's right, but often they make judgments based on what will get them reelected.
there was
Absolutely.
something you said a little earlier, which I wanted to ask a little bit more about. Did you have a role in yourself advocating against the use of nuclear weapons at a level that you think influenced the conversation internationally?
Yeah, I mean, I've had a chance to meet with a number of world leaders, but the occasion that strikes me as perhaps being most productive, because I got a chance to talk to this person about what was going to happen if the weapons were used, was a meeting at the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, in 2013. It was the first time there'd ever been a meeting there in which the Israeli nuclear forces were openly acknowledged and discussed. Israel does not formally accede to the fact that it's a nuclear-armed state. And this meeting was organized by some liberal members of the parliament. They invited a fellow named Moshe Feiglin, who is a very conservative member of the Likud party and a very strong proponent of Israel's nuclear forces. And he, to his credit, he came to this discussion. He came mainly to tell me what an idiot I was. I mean, he went on at great length about how I didn't know the difference between good and evil and so on. And finally I said, listen, let me tell you what's going to happen if Israel uses its nuclear weapons in a totally successful attack on its enemies. And explain to him the effects of a limited nuclear war and how this would be absolutely devastating to Israel. And then how you really needed to look at these weapons not as instruments of mutually assured destruction, but as instruments of self-assured destruction. A country that uses any significant number of these brings about its own destruction because of the climate disruption that it causes. He had never heard this. And he's far from alone in that bit of ignorance. He never heard this, and to his credit, he was able to listen, and he was very shaken. He was very shaken to understand that a war between India and Pakistan, over which Israel has no control at all, would be a disaster for Israel. And at the end, in front of a good-sized public audience of people who were mainly his political opponents, turned to me and said, I cannot agree with you that we need to get rid of all of our nuclear weapons, but maybe we do need to get rid of most of them. And I thought that was pretty good progress for a single conversation in a public venue. And to me, the value was it just showed that these people are making these decisions without knowing what's going to happen. And if we're able to get to them, as we got to Reagan, as we got to Gorbachev, and educate them, there's real chance that they can change and have more appropriate, wise policies take the place of the crazy policy that we have today. It's true of the United States government. The leadership, I'm not talking about this administration, I'm talking about the leadership in general, do not understand what's going to happen if nuclear weapons are used. We had high-level meetings at the State Department several years after the report on limited nuclear war in South Asia was released, they were unaware of this. This had been in the public domain for several years at this point. These are the people responsible for designing our nuclear policy. They should have known about this information. It was published in major scientific journals, and they didn't. And we told them about it, and they were impressed. And we asked them if they wanted us to do a briefing for the rest of the people at the State Department. And they said they'd get back to us, and they never did. And a couple of years later, we went in and met with the people who had taken positions since then, and had to brief them all over again because they'd never been given this information. And to not know that a limited nuclear war might destroy civilization when you're in a position where you might decide to launch such a war, it's really crazy.
Yeah, I think, to me, it seems they kind of live in a bubble,
Yeah.
you know, and they either cannot or will not listen, hear, whatever, what's happening outside the bubble.
Yeah.
They talk back and forth amongst each other, you know, and doing that seems to me to just kind of reinforce the party line, whatever that might be, and that's exactly, I think, what was happening there.
There's a long history of even the military not wanting to know really what the weapons would do. For a long time, the U.S. military did not take into account the thermal damage caused by nuclear weapons, which causes most of the destruction. They only wanted to know what the blast would do because they were looking at these as usable weapons that would take out a target.
Yeah.
And to be sure of taking out a hardened target, you're concerned with the blast. The fact that the same bomb would incinerate a much larger area, killing lots and lots of people, well, that wasn't the job the weapon was supposed to do, so they didn't want to know about it.
Yeah.
And they didn't. And nobody knew about the climate effects for decades into the nuclear era. And when people did find out about it, there was tremendous pushback. And this was really solid science, and it's been corroborated in recent years with new studies using better computers, more advanced climate models, and they all show the same thing. They show it's even worse than it was predicted to be back in the 80s. And the military planners just didn't want to hear about it. It was a very, very inconvenient truth. Because if using these weapons is an act of suicide, that makes no sense to have them. And then what happens to all their pretty plans?
Well, yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah. And all the hardware that it takes to deliver them.
Yeah. So, I think in terms of the political leadership here in Vermont, we should assume that they don't know as much about nuclear weapons as they should. They might be offended at our assuming that, but it's almost certainly true. And we need to educate them, and we need to bring political pressure on them at the same time. And great leaders can do what Gorbachev and Reagan did. They can change their mind when presented with the data. So we'll see if our current leaders can rise to greatness.
Very good. Well, I wanted to share a few notes about the Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont campaign. And I think that the education piece is really critical. And I'm thankful for the role of media in terms of helping to do that. And conversations like this happening around the state, I think, are very important. So the Back from the Brink campaign is on the national level. And on the statewide level, we have the Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont. These are our bumper stickers, which we're giving out free tonight, along with the free ice cream. Keep Vermont Bomber Free. And it's the canbvt.org. And we're working on passing a statewide resolution that will ban the basing of nuclear weapons delivery systems anywhere in the state of Vermont. And so we're asking Vermonters to contact their legislators, both their House of Representatives and state senators, to tell them to support this ban. And in the House, it's H.R. 7. And we're asking folks to call 828-2228 and to also communicate with the Military Affairs and Housing Committee through Tom Stevens. So we have this resolution, which folks can get a copy of. And this is the text of the resolution that we're asking for our state legislators to pass. So that's what this campaign is working on achieving at this point in time. And in terms of outreach and connecting with more Vermonters, I wondered if we could maybe turn our attention to that question about how do we reach people more broadly with this really critical message about our survival as a species, and not just our survival, but the survival of life on Earth.
Is there a website that people can go to get more information? I'm sorry, did you say that?
Yeah, it's www.canbvt.org.
Canbvt.org.
Yes, canbvt.org, Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers, Vermont. So, one upcoming event that we do have scheduled now is at the State House. We're going to be doing a 24-hour meditation protest for peace, protesting the basing of these F-35 bombers in Vermont. It's going to be co-hosted by the Monastic Academy for the Preservation of Life on Earth, which is a monastery located in Lowell, Vermont, along with Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont. And that will be going from 3 p.m. to 3 p.m. Wednesday, May 8th through Thursday, May 9th. We have 2 people who are devoted to sitting 24 hours straight, and they may be joined by others for the full 24 hours, but many of us will be joining for the last hour of sitting meditation, and that will be followed by a press conference. And so right now we're working hard on getting the word out around the state about that, because as an event it can very much appeal to different faith groups, different activist groups, climate change activists, and every spectrum of activists. And you had mentioned labor unions being involved in the Back from the Brink campaign. And so what are some resources that we have in terms of reaching out to fellow Vermonters to get more involved and to show up at the State House? Or another idea that has come up in our campaign is to do a movie series of retro films like Dr. Strangelove or The Day After. And I've heard of, some other good movies. There was one another friend told me about called Failsafe that presents a similar scenario. What are some other resources and ideas that people are working on now?
If you can find copies of a movie called The War Game, which is a BBC documentary from the 1960s, it is right up there with The Day After in terms of showing what an actual small nuclear war would look like. Local effects, not the global picture, but the local effects. It's terribly powerful and very, very realistic.
Yeah, one of the things that really concerns us, too light a word, that scares me, is the potential for miscommunication in all of these nuclear commands. Daniel Ellsberg, before he was involved with the Pentagon Papers, worked for the RAND Corporation. And the RAND Corporation had a contract with Department of Defense to go into lots and lots of nuclear commands to analyze how they communicated, how they didn't communicate. And the scary thing was that it's his book is called Doomsday Clock. And it describes what he found. He found that, let's say there was assumed to be an attack on the United States, and the United States launched their nuclear retaliation, their nuclear bombers. But it turned out there was a miscommunication. Daniel Ellsberg discovered there was no way to recall the nuclear weapons, the nuclear bombers that had already been launched towards their target. And that kind of miscommunication all the way up and down the line of chain of command was going on. That was the era that I would have flown deep into Russia and dropped the atomic bomb in the Bombay back where I was riding as a bomber navigator. There was not that capability to do it. I would be surprised as hell if that same situation wasn't true today. The whole command, control, communication structure is fraught with loopholes. I think it's especially dangerous now with the internet and the capability to hack into military computers, government computers. How is anybody going to know what's the right one, the right command? I think it's more scary with the emergence of the internet computer age. We've seen that happen time and time again. Adversaries hacking into government, into corporate computers. I mean, it's just unreal.
So there's real urgency about moving on this, and people who are interested should be in touch with the campaign here in Vermont. They should be in touch with their members of the State House of Representatives, urging them to support the resolution. And they should be thinking about what networks they have. Do they belong to a church that they could get to take a stand on this? Do they belong to a professional association or a union or a civic organization like a Rotary Club that they could get to take a position on this? And I think people need to understand that these are really extraordinary circumstances that we're living in. I was talking to a Rotary Club in particular a few weeks ago, and they said, I asked them to join, this was not in Vermont, to join the Back from the Brink campaign. And they said, well, we don't usually do that sort of thing. And I said, well, maybe you need to in this situation. During World War II, the whole country did things that they didn't usually do because they understood that the war effort required it. The current situation requires it. This is a greater danger than anything we faced in World War II. And we need to step away from some of the constraints that we put on our own behavior in order to do the things that need to be done. So I think it would be great if we could, get organizations like that to be part of this campaign, to, as an organization, contact the Vermont congressional delegation and say, I'm not calling for myself, I'm calling on behalf of my Rotary Club, or I'm calling on behalf of my union. Yeah. And we all want you. We've taken a formal decision. We don't want the F-35 to be stationed in Vermont. And we want to hear back from you about what you're going to do about that.
Were you able to persuade anyone in the Rotary Club?
Yeah, we've got a few Rotary Clubs now.
Well,
Very good.
My experience has been quite a bit different, I'm afraid. A couple of times I've addressed church groups, I've addressed civic groups, I've addressed peace groups. And when I broach the subject, the faces that I see out there, the audience, they move from looking a bit interested to expressions of shock, disbelief, and turn off. It's just too much for them to deal with.
I think sometimes people turn off if they don't see a path forward, if they don't see what they can do. When I've been talking to groups about the Back from the Brink campaign all over the country, the response is shock, disbelief, horror, and when I tell them something they can do about it, a determination to do something. And we've gotten, at this point, we have over 200 organizations, many of them national, many of them local, that have joined this campaign in the last year. And it's growing very rapidly across the country.
Good.
We've gotten the Los Angeles and Washington, D.C. city councils, the Baltimore City Council have all voted unanimously to support this campaign. The U.S. Conference of Mayors, broad, 70% Democratic, 30% Republican, voted unanimously to support this campaign and this call for a new nuclear policy. It was voted overwhelmingly by the California State Legislature. So I think when we're able to give people something concrete to do, then they don't turn off. And again, here in Vermont right now, there's something very concrete for people to do. This campaign is a terrific vehicle for people to use to express to the whole U.S. government their desire for fundamental change in nuclear policy. And I think what we will find is if we go out and ask people to support this, they will support it because it makes sense.
So everyone here has signed on to our resolution as a citizen co-sponsor, so thank you very much. And that's another part of our campaign is getting more Vermonters to sign on. So it's another really important step that people can take to feel more empowered in the face of this.
And individuals can do that by going to the website, right? They can sign on online.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, the key is getting enough signatures, getting enough voices, getting enough faces in front of our elected representatives and scare the bejesus out of them, saying, I'm a constituent and I vote.
And that's partly why we wanted to do this meditation demonstration outside of the State House before the legislature session ends this spring, is to show them a big visible outpouring of people saying, no, it's not acceptable that, you don't do something about this. And we do expect you to take action.
That's great.
So.
This will succeed. We will stop this.
So one thing I was wondering about for the sake of our presentation here, even though we might need to do a little bit of editing, would be if each person could go around and state their name and their affiliation and what brings them to the conversation.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm Andy Shirkey. I live in Shaftesbury, Vermont. I'm active with an organization called Veterans for Peace with the Vermont chapter. We have met with the state representatives or their staff people and told them what we think about bringing the F-35 to Vermont, which is not only no, but hell no. Particularly, our chapter is concerned. We are alarmed, becoming overwhelmingly alarmed at the mounting evidence that President Trump is planning to attack Iran. And that's one of the things we're very active in trying to prevent right now. We think it's important to deny the F-35 here, but we want to stop the next war in the Middle East. Thank you.
I'm Jane Sobel, and I'm a member of the Greater Bennington Peace and Justice Center. And I'm here to try and keep the F-35 out of Vermont. And I think it was great listening to all of you talk, and I will take this back to the next trustee meeting, which is the first Thursday of the month, which will help, I think, foster disseminating some of this information and getting people to contact their representatives. And we have a e-list, which hopefully the group will want to use, and there's a member of the Interfaith Council, local Interfaith Council, who can also bring information back to that group. And so at the very least, you should get some more signatures and more phone calls.
Wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Good for you. Very
Thank
good.
you. My name is Jennifer Decker, and I'm an organizer with the Citizens Against Nuclear Bombers in Vermont campaign. And my interest is a lifetime of family-based peace activism and knowledge that our social structures and social fabric of our society and our environmental needs are the things that our country ought to be pouring all of its resources into at this point in time. And I stand very strongly against the use and development of nuclear weapons anywhere in the world. And I'm particularly concerned with this issue being in the state that I live in, as well as the plan to base a nuclear-capable weapon within a mile or two of where I presently live.
My name is Ira Helfand. I'm a member of the International Steering Group of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, the recipient of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize, and I'm a co-president of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, the founding partner of ICANN, and itself the recipient of the 1985 Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm on the board of directors of IPPNW's U.S. affiliate, Physicians for Social Responsibility. And just very excited that citizens here in Vermont are taking a huge stand against this particular weapon system, the F-35, and in doing so, expressing their concern that we need a fundamental change in U.S. nuclear policy.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.